Well, welcome back. This is the 6th of 7 videos looking at Chapter 2 from Wheeler's most excellent risk management book. And this, we're going to be looking at another one of those additional readings for the course where we're looking at the Chief Information Security Officer's Application Security Guide. And it's a pretty long video, so we're going to move through it expeditiously. And we're going to really look at each of these three principal reasons why you invest in application security. So we'll have kind of one slide. It talks about security standards. You've got to do this because of all these standards that are out there. We'll have a couple of slides that talk about identification and remediation of vulnerabilities and all of the mechanisms you have to put into place to make that happen. And then we'll finish up by looking at implementation of countermeasures and controls against emerging threats that are targeting different types of applications. So let's go back and start with that first one, looking at compliance. And as I mentioned, there are all of these standards out there. Some of these standards, like the payment card industry, are voluntary, but if you're processing credit cards, you're going to have to do that. Others, like FISMA, HIPAA, FERPA, all of those are not optional. Those are going to be things that are dictated by law, and we've got to make sure that we implement that to protect federal information, personal information as it relates to students, and then health information. And as you're doing that, you've got to have mechanisms in place when standards conflict. Typically, you're going to take the stronger standard or the stronger security approach, and then you want to merge this into a security framework. As I've mentioned before, we're going to talk about 4 different security frameworks as a portion of the class. Just gotta wait for it. We're still in Chapter 2. But these standards drive why we invest in application security. And you will see arguments made that this investment is needed to comply with PCI or to comply with HIPAA or to comply with FERPA. And so it is a mechanism by which you're generating reasoning why you need to make a certain investment in risk management or information security. Next thing we're going to talk about is this idea of vulnerabilities, and there are certain things that you're going to do that are proactive and others that are going to be reactive. So we'll start off with the proactive, and that's looking at what threats exist against your potential environment. And that starts with going out and doing this asset management, figuring out what computing devices and networking devices you have out there, what operating systems and applications do you have, and what vulnerabilities they have. The second component of that is the reactive component of that, and that stuff happens. And when stuff happens, you have to react to it. So if someone clicks on a phishing message, and the fact that you have all of these controls in place doesn't matter. You're going to have to react to that, and you're going to have to react to that very quickly. So typically you want to have a combination of both of these different approaches, and you want to have investment in both areas. So you have to invest in systematically, proactively eliminating risk from the organization. And then you have to invest in the capacity to react to a situation and make the appropriate response based on something happening within the organization. As you're looking at that proactive component, that this asset-centric risk management, you're going to have to go out and figure out what assets you have out there. You have to go out and classify the data that is out there and figure out, well, where's my most sensitive data? How am I hardening that? Where's my public data, which I might not care about? The fact that it's public, everybody can see it. Do I really care? Do I really need to secure it that much? If it's on the front page of the New York Times already, do I need to secure it? Probably not. Patch management, this idea of going out and looking at the assets that we have and making sure that known vulnerabilities are addressed. Going out and doing threat profiling and looking at, from the perspective of the attacker, how am I going to come in and break into this system? And then finally, doing compliance testing. Are people actually doing what your policies say they're supposed to be doing? And so all of these different types of things are required to do that kind of proactive management of the system, but you've also got to invest in the reactive component of it. As you're doing that and you start to look at the risk that your organization is going to incur, and where we're going back to investing in application security. Some of that, the technical risk, you can actually measure pretty directly. So the impact on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, accountability as well, you should be able to go out and pretty directly manage or measure. For business risk management, this becomes a little bit more problematic because you've got to take into account estimates of the likelihood of something occurring and then the monetary losses that are going to be caused by that incident. And part of that you can do in science, and part of that you're going to have to do as an art approach to going out and figuring out how much we should invest in a particular system. As you're making those, you're going to come down to these kind of 4 decisions. Do I accept the risk? And it may be that it is a low likelihood, low impact event, and you've just decided, you know what, you're going to accept it. And the key is to then document it. Document it in writing. Document it so that everybody knows you're accepting that risk. It may be that you're going to share or transfer that risk to someone else. You may form a consortium. You may have not life insurance, but cyber insurance associated with those events that have a high impact but low probability, so that you lower the cost of addressing that. For those that have a very high probability, you may mitigate the risk or avoid the risk. Okay, mitigating the risk is putting in additional controls. Avoid the risk, you may come to the conclusion that I'm getting out of that business. I'm no longer going to offer those systems because the probability and the impact are so high. All right, well, we're in the middle of a video, but if we were in class, I'd have you form into teams, look at an example of a security control that you would be implementing, where it might fit into this, or a situation. It's not a security control, but a situation. Have you write that down and be ready to share it with the class. Because we're in the video, we're going to keep on moving. All right, next we're going to talk a little bit about, we were talking about the third group. We started with compliance. Remember back, it's only like 2 minutes ago. You can remember compliance, and we moved into vulnerabilities. Now we're moving into threats and countermeasures. And a lot of times when you're doing that threat analysis and emerging threat awareness, especially if you look over the last 10 or 20 years, you see a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, okay? And that's where you're using the fear of a data breach. You're using a vignette of someone else who was compromised as a mechanism for gaining investment in security. Hopefully you've moved away from that and you're not doing that anymore, and you've moved to a more objective approach to determining it. But I will tell you, you still see a lot of this out there. And in fact, if you have not seen FUD, there you go. There is FUD for you. It is cooked ham selecto. It's not just normal cooked ham. It's selecto cooked ham. But you want to make sure that you're moving away from this and you're moving to a more healthy diet, right? Not 14 pounds, 9 ounces of ham, but you're moving to something that's a little bit less ham, and perhaps and maybe not turkey, but maybe to steak in terms of how you're investing in your security program. All right. So to do that more objective approach, you got to think about how you're going to bring that to bear and come up with a different approach. And here's a mechanism for doing that. All right. You can start with estimating the impact of the costs on the event, doing a quantitative risk calculation of the annual cost of doing this, optimize that security cost in relation to the cost of the security incidents and measures, and then calculate a return on investment. Okay? So actually getting into a return on investment based on a risk-based application security budgeting approach. All right? And so that's really what this article talks about for the remainder. And we're going to do it in about 2 slides. But is this idea of, if you're going to do investment, let's do it in an adult way. And so let's start off with that first one, this idea of estimating the impact of costs incurred in the event of a security incident. Well, you're going to go out and look at, well, what's the financial impact? What's the likelihood of this? And as you're looking at those types of impact, you've got to consider reputation, loss of revenue, loss of data, inability to comply with statutory service, adverse impact on the individuals, and again, there'll be a loss of revenue there. There'll be a loss of reputation. You're probably going to have to buy them some form of security protection for a couple of years. So as you're doing that estimation, you have to roll all of that together. As you do that, the value of data is going to be important, and the likelihood of data is going to be important. All right, and generally, the range right now is somewhere between $500 to $2,000 per record is the value of the data. Now, it depends if we're talking FERPA data, HIPAA data, FUSMA data. They have different values, but look at the range of this, and again, this starts to add up to extremely high dollar values if you have a significant compromise. The next thing you've got to do is you've got to go out and look at the likelihood, and while you can make that stuff up, the Open Security Foundation Data Loss Database is one source of the likelihood of various types of attacks. And you have to then compare that against your environment and what assets you have in your environment to say, well, how does this relate to me? Because the database obviously is going to have lots of different threats out there that just don't apply to your potential environment. Then going to move in and look at the quantitative risk calculation associated with this. And one way of doing this is a single loss expectancy, where you're looking at if a single loss occurred, you're taking the asset value and you're looking at the exposure factor, which is the percent of that asset that's going to be lost, and it's a simple calculation. The problem is calculating AV and EF is hard. The asset value sometimes is a little bit easier, but again, you're calculating the value of data, which is again hard. And then what you would like to be able to do is take that SLE, the single loss expectancy, roll it into a second formula, your annual loss expectancy, your ALE, where ALE is going to be that SLE times the annual rate of occurrence. How often do we expect this single loss expectancy to occur? And if you think of that ALE, what it really is you're multiplying the value times the likelihood. That's really what it is. Okay? And so as you go through this process, these are going to be key definitions that you're going to see over and over again within risk management. As you're doing that, here's an example of that. You've got a department, 5,000 student records out there. Each record is worth 400, and the exposure factor, which means how much of that 400 are you supposed to lose, you should be able to calculate your SLE pretty straightforward. 5,000 times 400 per record times 0.15 equals $300,000. Okay? And then, if you're going to have an attack twice a year, what's your ALE? It's at 300,000 times 2, which is 600,000. So if your annual loss expectancy is $600,000, again, go back to that chart we covered earlier on where you had the two kind of crossing lines that kind of bowed up to each other. If you're spending less than $600,000 on this, you might be spending too little. If you're spending more, why? Well, wouldn't it make more sense to just take the losses if it's going to cost you on average about $600,000 a year? And so the optimal investment is where, and this is what the article purports, is about 37% of that. So if the 600,000 times 37%, we should be spending about $222,000 a year to protect against malware. And that allows you to say, well, am I in the right place in terms of my security investments to protect me? Now, some may argue, wait, is 37% really the right amount to be investing in this? And again, you have to kind of go back to that chart that we kind of talked about. The optimal spending is one where you're minimizing both the cost of the incidents and the security measures to maximize the benefit. And it's all in the details. That's the problem. So this is that chart I was talking about where you're looking at what's the cost of those malware attack failures, what's the cost of the security measures or controls that we're putting in place, and how are we protecting each other as we're going forward. So again, very, very challenging to kind of do this work, but this gives you a mechanism that is much, much better than fear, uncertainty, and a doubt. It addresses compliance, it addresses vulnerabilities, it addresses the countermeasures, and it does so in a relatively straightforward, meaningful way. So keep ALE, SLE in mind. Look at how does this chart draft out? How do you make decisions about investments in application security that make sense? If you want to do return on investment, you're going to take that ALE and measure it by the percent of control effectiveness, because all controls are not perfect. All right, and you're going to subtract out of that the cost of the controls and divide by the cost of controls. And so in this particular case, if you were able to get that 33 or 37% investment, you're going to come out with a return on investment of a security investment of 1.43. It's a positive number. That's a good number for doing things. If you get below 1, you get a problem in terms of your return on investment for a security investment. All right, well, oh, my goodness, we've gotten to the end of 7 of 7 videos looking at security. We've covered Chapter 2, talking about business-driven risk. We've talked about some core definitions early on. We moved into cultural theory. We then moved into doing a counterpoise, if you will, to that cultural theory with the Boynton article, looking at how do we do a multi-attribute decision matrix and do some calculations in terms of 2 different investments in security and which is the better investment. From there, we moved into the Chief Information Security Officer's Application Security Intro. This previous or what we've been covering in this video, which talked about starting with compliance, vulnerabilities, and countermeasures, and then moved into a systematic mechanism of investing in security that makes sense and does some risk-based budgeting as we're going forward. All right, well, this finishes up Chapter 2. We're onward and upward to Chapter 3, looking at risk management lifecycle. So keep on studying, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.